Warning: this podcast may contain graphic and triggering content. Please listen at your own risk. Each individual struggle is different, and everyone's recovery and healing journey is different. Please reach out to a certified medical professional if you need help. Welcome to episode 32 of Stomp the Stigma, the podcast aimed to fight the stigma surrounding mental health through education, awareness, experiences, stories, resources, and the vulnerable truth. Joining me to Stomp the Stigma today is music therapist Fleur Hughes. She's my second music therapist that I am having on the podcast, and I had such a great conversation with her. I'm so excited for you guys to hear this one. We talked all about what music therapy is, her journey into music therapy, as well as a little bit about music and culture as she has lived in 3 different continents, plus a little bit about when you would use music therapy or when music therapy would be better or more effective than the alternative. Fleur also spent 5 years in the British Army, so we got to talk a little bit about mental health in the military and first responders, as well as her transition back to society after serving and what that was like for her, and how music therapy helped with that journey. So I hope you guys love this episode as much as I do. I think it was a great conversation and some great insight into music therapy as well as life in the military. So enjoy. Okay, well, thank you for joining me again. I'm excited to talk to you about both music therapy and your experience in the military. I know those are kind of 2 very different things. Well, in your case, not so different things, but I'm excited to hear both sides of that story.
Oh, thank you, Alana. And yes, thanks for having me here again. We actually had spoken a few weeks ago, and I had then reached out to you after the podcast to say, actually, would you mind re-interviewing me? Because upon sort of reflection, I had realized that some of the answers perhaps weren't my best answers. So, thank you for giving me a second chance. And I think in terms of a mental health perspective, that's a really important thing to keep in mind. I know a lot of students, when we're going through exams and writing tests, it's like if I don't get an A plus or an A the first time, I'm really hard on myself. But you can rewrite an exam or a test. And sometimes in life, whether it's imposter syndrome or this idea of being perfectionist, actually being able to say, you know what, maybe that wasn't my best, and I need to try again. So this is my do-over. So thank you very much.
Oh, you're so welcome. I'm excited. I think this one's going to be even better than the first one. Okay, I want to start with the music therapy side of things. As you know, you are the second music therapist to come on the podcast. And I did ask this question to Jessie when she was on, but I'm curious what your answer is as well. So in your opinion or definition, what is music therapy?
So music therapy is the use of music and music-based elements, for example, pitch, rhythm, or melody, to meet a specific goal or aim. So as an example, how would you use rhythm to help someone with Parkinson's improve their gait? How would you use lyric analysis and the process of analyzing lyrics to help you with your own sort of anxiety? At the core of the work that we do as music therapists is the therapeutic relationship. So that means the relationship that I have with the person that I'm working with. And in my perspective or approach, I work from a humanistic perspective. So that means I see the person that I'm working with as the expert in their own sort of health management. And that means that I always meet them from a place of unconditional positive regard, with empathy, and always understanding that I am there to assist or support you in meeting your goals or aims. And the thing that I love the most about music therapy is this idea of connection, because we all connect with music at some level, and we all have some relationship or experience in how music has shaped our lives or informed us as people.
I find music therapy so interesting and something that I've never really heard about much before, or before a few months ago, I guess. So I'm very interested. So, how did you get into music therapy in the first place? Like, was that something that you always wanted to do?
So my experience of music therapy was sort of a long and winding road. Essentially, many moons ago, I'd finished doing my bachelor degree in South Africa. That was around 2002. And then I ended up moving to the UK, and my bachelor degree was a performance degree. So my very first job that I had was actually as a high school music teacher, and in my early 20s, it was a tough job. So I actually, after 3 years, just went through a lot of burnout and had to spend some time reflecting on, is this job great for my mental health? And at the time, I realized it wasn't. So I started exploring, what is something else that I can do? And a friend had mentioned to me, had you ever thought about joining the army as a musician, the British Army? And, I hadn't. But I was like, I'm in a job that sort of, at that time, was just sort of sucking the life force out of me. And I thought, if I make a change in my job, maybe it'll make me a happier person. And so I ended up leaving teaching and I ended up joining the army. And it was actually my time in the military that led me to my third career choice, which was to become a music therapist. And I think a lot of us through our lives might go through different roles, different jobs, and different things that will lead us one day to finding the thing that is really your passion and your enjoyment, which obviously for me is music therapy. But part of my journey to become a music therapist was in during my time in the army. My first few years was as a musician, and then I decided, I wanted to try something different. I'd always been a musician, and I ended up going into a different job role. And in 2009, I ended up going out to Afghanistan, and it was my sort of time on operational tour that got me thinking about, how can we manage our own mental health in different ways. Obviously, when you're on operations, there's a lot of stress, physical, emotional, mental stress, a lot of pressure. And it just made me think a little bit about, when I'm sort of working on my own well-being, how do I do that? And music was always a way that I would use that as a coping mechanism. And so while I was on tour, I literally just Googled, music therapy UK or music therapy courses. I started thinking a little bit more about, what is therapeutic about music? Is there something like music therapy? And essentially found the course that I ended up enrolling in, which was a master's program in Bristol at the University of West England. And I ended up leaving the army a few years later to go and do my master's. And it's interesting as well when I think about one's life's journey is there's, in terms of mental health, a lot of fear, a lot of apprehension, a lot of worry around, if I leave this one thing, is the next thing going to be the right thing to do? And sometimes it's circumstance. Sometimes it's an epidemic that says, actually, you know what? You've lost a job. It's time to do something different. Sometimes it was just a thought. It's like this one thing isn't working out for me. Someone suggested this. Let me try it. And in terms of even therapy, if you ever want to access therapy, it's also finding the form of therapy that works for you. Because it might be that one type of therapy you'll try it doesn't work for you. Explore something else. And for me, a big reason that I sort of was really drawn to the creative arts is because in music therapy, the music is the framework. It isn't the talking. So all the things that you need to work through, whether whether it's anxiety, stress, guilt, fear, whatever it is, you do that within the music and a music-based technique instead of a talking-based therapy.
They say that the average person changes careers like 5 or 6 times throughout their life, but yours were all somewhat related, moving from career to career. So music has always been a part of your life since you were young?
Yes, very much
Yeah.
so. And even though I had three sort of very different careers, educator, being a teacher, music teacher, to soldier, being in the military, to therapist, they also had three jobs that were very interrelated through the music. The music was always sort of the base. But also, I think in some ways, my skills as a therapist, my observational skills, my listening skills, those are skills I sort of developed and fine-tuned within the military. But in terms of, being able to schedule, being able to think on your feet, being able to deal with a very busy workload, those were certainly skills that I gained in teaching.
Mm-hmm.
So you might change career, in my case, 3 times in your life, but none of the skills that you learn are wasted skills.
That's a very good point. I'm on my second career, which is completely different from the first one, but
You
I
have a
think
very interesting career.
the skills have definitely transferred. Yeah, that's a good point.
What was your first job, may I ask?
I was in oil and gas for 7 years before I switched to beer. So it's very different. I was still in a lab, but yeah, not quite the same.
And again, I think for a lot of people, many people can relate to that. I actually know of many people who are teachers
Mhm.
who leave teaching to become psychologists or therapists. I know of many people when they leave the military actually become teachers. So again, in oil and gas, I know
Yeah.
many people who've left oil and gas and who've gone and found other careers, whether it be in the military, whether it be as a therapist, whether it be as a teacher. And I call them, transferable skills. So
Mhm.
no job is ever wasted time. And
Absolutely.
definitely learning, no degree is ever a wasted piece
Yeah.
of education.
Yeah. Oh, I agree. I agree. So since you deal with music or you listen to music and you interact with music all day at work, do you listen to music at home or in your free time as well?
It's a bit of a 50-50. Sometimes I do use music to help with my own sort of emotional or physical regulation. If I'm having a day where I'm feeling rather stressed or tense, I will certainly put on some Nine Inch Nails or I don't know, some Rage Against the Machine, Marilyn Manson, something with a really heavy rhythm to sort of help me decompress and deal with that. But other days, I have to say something that I'm enjoying more in my life is getting used to embracing the silence and having quiet time. And I think what's important about that is it just gives me time to sort of physically rest my ears, my voice, but also just an emotional level to enjoy and process things without the need to say something. So enjoying, within music, a pause or a rest serves its function.
Yeah.
And so in my own life, I take that musical application and apply it to myself.
Yeah.
And mindfulness has become a big part of that. And that is something that I can speak to as well, is the use of mindfulness with music. So being more mindful as to, are we listening to music with words, or are we listening to music that has no words? If we're listening to music with words, what do the words say to us? What are the words saying? So thinking about the messaging of the music. If we're listening to music which is instrumental, how does that affect our body, our mind? And again, with the listening, I do a lot of breath work.
Mhm.
So coming back to, I might put on a piece of relaxation music. I love minimalist music, so maybe some Philip Glass, and I'll just sit comfortably and breathe to the music. If you are choosing music for relaxation, some of the tips I can give you is thinking about music with a sort of steady tempo, music that isn't too fast, but music that isn't too slow, and essentially instrumental music for breath work is very important. In my own experience, I find when I listen to music with words, it detracts from the breathing because I become so focused on what the words are saying.
Yeah.
So for relaxation, some instrumental music in your preferred genre is a great place to start, and to just sit down and breathe along with the music. And mindfulness tells us there really is no right or wrong way to breathe. It is just about being aware of the breath. And some days I use that. I'll listen to a piece of music, and once the music has helped me to ground, I'll spend a few minutes just sitting in the quiet and enjoy taking in that space.
Oh, I love that. Okay, I want to move to kind of your work a little bit. You mentioned that you're going to be offering music therapy through Supporting Wellness here in Calgary.
Yes.
Um, do you have a plan kind of when that's going to be happening and what's going on there?
Yes, so the plan is a full transition around September. So I have my day job. My day job, I'm very lucky. Many therapists will have their full-time job, and then they sort of have their contracting in or private practice work. So my sort of day job is in a school, but this work with supporting wellness will be providing individual and or group sessions, either virtual or in person. They have a beautiful space just in McLeod Trail. And the idea is that'll be mostly evenings or weekends starting in September. And mostly working with children, but adults as well. They can be individual sessions, they can be sort of family or duo-based sessions, and within that work, some of the stuff that I'll be doing will be receptive music therapy. So that means the listening-based interventions, whether that's music and mindfulness, whether it's analyzing lyrics, whether it's using music for relaxation, helping music to reduce anxiety or to de-stress, and then the active-based stuff, and that's the doing stuff. So that could be improvisation, singing, songwriting, drumming, and so forth. And if it's at the space, I will be providing instruments, so people don't have to bring their own instruments. I provide those. If they're virtual, if somebody, for instance, would love to learn how to play the ukulele while sort of managing their mental health, so using the uke to help you to de-stress, that works really well virtually. But now that we're sort of transitioning back to in-person, I will be doing in-person sessions as well. And supporting wellness, are quite a cool practice because they have so many things that they provide, like EMDR. They do a lot of sort of body-based work. They have traditional talk therapy, but then they also do neurofeedback, and they have this new cool thing called an equiscope, which can sort of help with chronic pain management. So, if you are looking for any sort of psychological or family services, you can certainly look at what they do at www.supportingwellness.com. And then you can also read up about music therapy, which they offer, as well as their speech and language services.
Wow, very cool. Very cool. I love that music can be transferred between any culture, you don't have to speak the same language to kind of understand or appreciate the beauty in the music. You can bond with other people in that way without really communicating. If I don't know how to explain that, but if that makes
The
sense.
connect, because you don't need the language to communicate when you
Yeah.
have the relationship or the connection or that sort of the experience that's happening between two
Yeah.
people.
Yeah. So you did your music therapy training in the UK. So I'm curious if there's a significant difference between that and if you were to train here in North America.
So yes, there are some fundamental differences. In the UK, music therapy is at a master's level, and in Canada, it's at a bachelor level. Also, in the UK, music therapy is regulated. So the title is regulated, the profession is regulated, which means if you haven't got your master's and done your training, you cannot call yourself a music therapist. In Canada, it's a bit of a wild west. So some provinces are regulated. So counselling therapy is regulated, for instance, in Ontario or PEI. Alberta is currently going through the process. So the Association of Counselling Therapy of Alberta, ACTA, will become the College of Counselling Therapy of Alberta once regulation happens. And it's important because I think, one of the big things around any form of therapy that you seek, not just music or art or drama, but any therapy, is to make sure that you seek somebody who is competent, you seek somebody who follows a code of ethics, you seek somebody who understands what their scope of practice is. And, from a cultural or value standpoint, that is very important as well because people need to know, if I work with somebody who perhaps isn't from my sort of Western perspective, what are cultural things that I need to keep in mind? If somebody comes to me seeking therapy perhaps and it's something that I cannot help with, I need to be able to refer out and know, these are my limitations, but who can I refer to so that this person finds the best help for them? It's always about protecting the public, so that is why regulation is key, and also protecting yourself as a professional and those people who you work with. Because there are some unscrupulous people out there who are not regulated, who do not have the training, who maybe not, unscrupulous, but who perhaps aren't informed that music therapy actually is something you need to go train for. And they might think, I play guitar, I sing, therefore it must be therapy. Actually, it's not. A big part of music therapy as well, I think, is understanding counterindications and triggers in music. Because you may listen to a song that might trigger a certain memory or emotion that could make you feel very angry. And then you decide that you need to go work through some of that anger or those emotions. And if you didn't see someone who's a music therapist, they may not know how to safe or ethically use music to address that sort of emotion that you need to work through. So regulation is important. Canada is moving forward with this, which makes me very happy. And I think another thing as well in the UK with music therapy is the perception of what is music therapy and what is not. And I think another thing here is just for people to empower themselves, and if they're not sure if the person who they see is a music therapist, they can always go look at the Canadian Association of Music Therapists, the CMT, or the Music Therapy Association of Alberta, MTA, to make sure that their music therapist has the training, has completed their internship, has their MTA status, that's key, and essentially that the person that they're working with is a qualified professional, because we as music therapists certainly are.
Yes, that is very important, definitely. We kind of hinted at the fact that you have lived in South Africa and the UK, and now you're in Canada. Have you seen kind of cultural differences in the way that people use music in those different places?
Yes, most definitely. Um, I think it's interesting, when I grew up in South Africa, music was used very much in a traditional sense. The various indigenous populations in South Africa have their own style of music. For instance, there's something called township jazz, which has a very sort of specific sound. If you hear it, it sounds very South African. You can sort of hear, you can hear through the rhythm, the melody, the pulse of the music. It really speaks to that sort of cultural population. When I moved to the UK, I knew nothing about country music, and actually, it was in my third year of training. I did the third year of my degree. I had to do my practicum here in Canada because at that point we were here. We came to Canada in 2014. Um, and having never grown up with country music in North America, people listen to country music, so that is something I had to incorporate into my own sort of learning. Some of my instruments that I use as well in Canada, for instance, I have a washboard, I have musical spoons, things that, as I sort of developed relationships with people, a lot of people who grew up in the prairie and farms were like, I can relate to a washboard. It's something my grandparents used. So I got a washboard. And when people see the instrument, they make that connection. They tell me their story. Why do we have this instrument? This is what it's about. I think for many cultures, certainly again in South Africa, there's a certain aspect of traditional medicine where music is used to help people to heal, um, and sort of work for their well-being using music. In the UK, music therapy is seen as a profession, as I mentioned, a regulated profession. So therefore, my work is no dissimilar to what a psychologist or a social worker or another therapist would do. Um, I think from a cultural point in Canada, we still seem to perhaps think that music therapists have this recreational purpose. But actually, no, our work is more mental health based. And also, depending the clients that we work with, understanding what are some of the cultural implications with music. Every culture has their instruments, has a rhythm or a song or a folk tune that represents them. In many cultures, we use music in times of joy, like weddings. We use music at times of sadness and death. And for many people, if we think about even in the military, the traditional military music, which is a culture on its own, goes back hundreds and hundreds of years when, in the olden days in the battlefield, you had the drummer walk onto the field, the fife player. Certainly in the military with repatriation parades, celebrations, pass-up parades, music forms a very big part of that. And even in Canada, what I found so interesting is moving to the prairie. I was in Medicine Hat, and then I moved to Calgary. But it's also just this application of country music and the stories and the sort of things that country music tells us. It's in its own way, its own little culture and tradition. Um, and as therapists, we have to be aware of what are some of the cultural implications in using music. I can also speak to that, when you work with First Nations people or Indigenous people, huge protocols around instruments. It's like I don't just pick up the buffalo drum and play it. Being able to understand, what is the cultural tradition behind this instrument? How is it used in their culture? If I were to use a buffalo drum, um, which group of people can I use it with? Can't I use it with? And as therapists, being culturally aware and having those conversations with the clients. And part of our assessment will be, what instruments am I allowed to use, aren't I allowed to use, as well as other cultural protocols. I can speak to smudging, for instance. As a European therapist, I'm not just going to pitch up and smudge. It's interesting. There's a lot of smudging on Instagram. We see smudging everywhere. But again, it's about cultural appropriation. Like, is this something we should be doing if we don't really understand the meaning behind it? So, also with drumming, I always make a point that when I drum from, I don't want to say like an African perspective, but I grew up in South Africa, so my form of drumming is very polyphonic, very rhythmical. I use djembe drums and so forth. And if I were to drum with, for example, Indigenous teens, I would be aware and understand that it may not be something suitable to a boys' group, because perhaps from a cultural point of view, that is not how my work would be informed. And having those discussions and conversations. I think it's so interesting to learn about different people's cultures and understanding and worldview, and all of those things inform us as well as therapists in the work that we do. And for some of us, it's also understanding, again, like, one form of therapy may be better suited than another one. So, for instance, something like EMDR is often used with military populations, or arts-based therapies. Again, with teenagers, even certain interventions. With the teens that I work, a lot of them like doing lyric analysis. A lot of them like the physical act of playing or drumming because it helps you to relieve some of those emotions you're feeling. If we think about working with populations like dementia populations, singing a song, listening to familiar songs can help with memory recall. If I think about Parkinson's, some of the work that we do, so again, that sort of rhythmic aspect, like how would rhythm help someone to retrain their brain to walk, to even things like depression. Maybe during COVID, many of us have felt that our mental health is lower. We're not feeling great. So perhaps you need to do some songwriting to explore what is it that I'm working through. If you can't actually say that this is how I feel, maybe some instrumental playing will just help you to free up emotionally or physically to help you to start saying, this is some of the stuff that I'm going through. So yeah, just even in terms of, and from a cultural point of view, being aware to knowing, like, as a therapist, as a female, can I work with certain populations? Dress. How do I need to dress when I'm working with certain people? The space. Again, are certain instruments going to look a certain way, or be appropriate to use with a population? Again, especially if for instance, I wouldn't use like a handmade rattle if I didn't understand what the significance of the skin of the rattle was, how this would be used, and so forth. And I think, certainly in the last few years, we've perhaps all become a bit more culturally aware and culturally sensitive to how we look and how we dress when working with people from other sort of traditions and so forth.
Wow. That is so interesting. I feel like I'm just learning so much every time that I talk to you. I was going to ask you kind of what is it about music that is so therapeutic? I mean, you did touch on kind of instances that you use music therapy for, but is there kind of something else behind that? Like why music is so therapeutic to begin with?
I think, it's interesting. Part of it is how we respond physically to music.
Hmm.
I think everybody can relate to the fact that if you're feeling tense, and your shoulders are tense, low level headache, your body's tense, when you listen to rhythmic driving music or you go and dance to some electronic dance music, there's an immediate sort of physical release, your body relaxes. Whether same could be said about playing the guitar, singing, drumming, there's a physical aspect of music. Like the music doesn't happen unless you create it. I think the other part of it is the emotional aspect. I think, we all connect with the music at some level. For some of us, it's through memory. For some of us, it's through a relationship, a song that connects us to another person, a song that's lifted us up through a bad breakup, a song that brings us down when we need it. The connection piece is very important. I think another thing as well is music is sort of and intrapersonal. There's this relational thing that happens within music. If you go and watch a performance, you are there, you're in that moment, you enjoy the performance. There may be some form of therapeutic benefit in how that makes you feel, but that isn't necessarily therapy. In therapy, the therapy aspect of music, which is not different to talking therapy, but it's about that sort of connection, the communication, the how am I using music to reflect back? This is what the client feels. This is what the client needs. How am I using music to ground the client? How am I using music to create dialogue? Like the client's telling me this. How is the therapist to reflect that back to say, I'm hearing what you're saying. I'm here to support you. Or actually, I need you. I want to challenge you. I want you to think about it this way. But I think, with music, I'm yet to find someone who hasn't been impacted or have had some relationship with music. It lifts us up when we're down. It brings us down when we're up. It's a constant in our lives, and it's something that connects us from the moment you're born. You're you're in the womb. You hear the rhythm of the heartbeat. To as a child, you learn your songs. You develop a language, the use of nursery rhymes. To a teenager, you deal with all your frustration through listening to music. To an adult, you get married, you listen to a wedding march. You go through your whole life and it's there, and then one day, when you die, you have hymns, you have a funeral march, but it's something that's just such a part of our lives that it's always there. So I love that about music. It's this thing that we always have. And in therapy, we figure out in music therapy, how do we use it to just pinpoint where somebody else might need some extra help.
Hmm. Yeah, absolutely. There's a lot of people that use music on their own to kind of cheer themselves up or make them feel better, without the therapy portion of it. So, yeah, that's a really good point.
And I think with the therapy, it's the intentional part.
Yeah.
It's the intentional part. And in some ways, within music therapy, you also develop a very intimate relationship with music because you understand how the music affects the person that you're working with. And you need to be very cautious in how you use the music. And that is why also in therapy, as with talk therapy, we as music therapists, we do an assessment. We think what are the goals and aims going to be that this person needs to achieve. We work through a sort of treatment plan. At the end, we evaluate what we do. And, that is not dissimilar to what other therapeutic, that is not dissimilar to what other therapists would do. So, there's a whole process and a procedure. And that is what sort of makes music therapy different to performance. So music as performance would be you listening to the orchestra, you being in the orchestra, or playing an instrument, learning an instrument. But that process of assessment, that process of what is this goal, that process of what am I trying to achieve. It isn't about a polished performance. It's about really tapping into the innate musicality of somebody. And I think that's the other thing that makes music therapy so unique is that, I've worked with people who have physical limitations, people who are nonverbal, people who've had no musical training, and music therapy really works with somebody's most innate musical sense, irrelevant of how old they are, at which part in their lifespan they're at. It really is for anyone and everybody.
That kind of leads into I have a few questions that kind of all go together, but um are there certain situations where music therapy would be more beneficial than kind of an alternative form of therapy like talk therapy or something else? Or I guess what situations would someone use music therapy in instead of the alternative? And are there situations where it would work better than the alternative? Or is it just another form of therapy?
I think it's both.
Hmm.
I think that there are times. I think I'll speak to both points. I think sometimes it needs to be as a co-treatment. So I think like maybe somebody would, like I would maybe have to use some of my counseling skills, my verbal skills with somebody, and then we add in the music, and the change in the experience happens within the music. Somebody can also probably tell me like this is how I feel as I'm engaging in this musical framework. This is what's happening to me. This is where I'm noticing the change. Sometimes it's another piece where maybe somebody goes and has 3 sessions of, I don't know, let's say talk therapy. They find it's not working for them. Maybe they need to be referred to me as a music therapist. I do 5 sessions just to help the person free up. It's like, maybe you're feeling tense and stressed about going to talk therapy. Well, maybe you need a few sessions of music therapy to help you to free up. And then I would refer them back to their talk therapist. Maybe it's doing co-therapy. I do co-therapy. So, I've worked with psychologists and OTs, PTs, where it's, as an example, with a physiotherapist, they might be doing body-based rehab stuff, and then I use the music as a supporting mechanism. Nothing's going to motivate you to want to, I don't know, use a rowing machine better than someone providing you music to do that, or a song that's going to motivate you to, want to go and exercise. Maybe we're working on emotional regulation. A great way, for somebody to process anger and feeling stressed is to play an instrument, and maybe we'll do some loud drumming to help someone ground themselves. And then, maybe that opens a space for somebody to say, actually, this is why I'm feeling this way. So sometimes also if somebody is nonverbal, if somebody perhaps, might use sign language or other forms of communication like a talking device or visuals, music therapy is a great way to incorporate the way that they communicate. For instance, I might do songwriting, and if somebody has a assistive technology device, they could use that within the songwriting. They don't even need to speak, they can use their AT device. Um, if somebody, for instance, has been in a car, let's say an accident, they are now in a wheelchair, or perhaps they're in a bed, they can't move. Maybe we can use music-based technology, so iPad apps, to help someone find a form of self-expression or work through their self-awareness through using apps. So there are so many different interventions that we use, and I think that's the great thing is, we have so many tools in our toolkits as a music therapist that really, when I meet somebody to do therapy, the therapy looks different. If you came to me, Alana, and you had a session, your session would look so different based on your needs compared to when I'm working in the elementary school with kids, compared to when I'm working with, a family who maybe needs some support with their teen. Looks so different to somebody who's at end of life care who needs a song to do some legacy work, to have a memory of that person to keep on once they pass away. So, with music therapy, people might say, but, I want you to do that form of therapy with me like you're doing for so and so. My response will be, actually, no, the way that music therapy is going to look to you is truly unique for you. It is not a one size fits all model.
One question that just came to me. I'm curious, as a therapist yourself, do you go to therapy?
Yes, I do. That's another really important. That's another thing in the UK. So actually, part of my training as I was becoming a music therapist during my master's degree was you had to go through your own personal therapy, and that is a process that I've upheld in my own life. Because as a therapist, I need to be the best therapist that I can be for my clients, and therefore I need to be able to work through whatever issues or mental health concerns I might have.
Mhm.
You know, if I'm feeling anxious, if I'm stressed, if I'm tired, if I'm, being sort of, I don't know, bitey because I'm at the end of my tether, how can I be an effective therapist? I need to work through those things to be able to pitch up and be there for my clients.
Right.
So, yeah, sometimes therapists need therapy, and that's okay.
Absolutely, that's okay. I think everybody should go to therapy.
You know what? I think another misconception is we have this idea of what therapy must look like.
Yeah.
Perhaps we all think a therapist looks a certain way. We all think therapy, once you're in it, you're going to be in it for 15 years. But for some people, maybe single sessions is what they need. Just like a session where you do a check in and you have somebody help you for a short amount of time,
Yeah.
and it might be 3 months. My sort of average treatment plans are mostly 10 weeks. So they're sort of based on the seasons. 10 weeks doesn't sound like a lot, but if you think about school, it's a fall program, a winter program, a spring program. You do need to see a certain amount of change. So the way that I work, I don't just do one session. Normally, I would say, 6, 8, or 10 weeks. I've had people who've had 6 weeks and that's all that they've needed, and then they come back to me 6 months later for another 6 weeks. I've had other people who I have worked with for 3 years. So it looks unique, and just because someone's been with me for 3 years, that doesn't mean the therapy isn't working. It just means that within those 3 years, their needs change. Maybe they come
Mhm.
to me at the start, and we might have done instrumental playing, but then actually they wanted to do lyric analysis, but then they actually wanted to learn an instrument to help with self-regulation. So again, there is not one size fits all thing. But again, if you are also looking at accessing therapy, one of the questions you have every right to ask when you go and see a therapist is, how long would you like to, how many sessions do you think that I need? And listen to what the therapist says based on their judgment and their training, and their knowledge as well.
Mhm. That is a very good point. I've always seen kind of on therapy websites and stuff where you have to do a minimum of 6 sessions or something like that, and I never really understood why that was, but that makes a lot of sense. That makes a lot of sense to me.
And for me, something that's really important, and I think also something, at Supporting Wellness, their motto is change is possible. And I think that's the other thing with therapy is we as therapists, we look for that moment of change. Within the music, it's a lot more evident. If I see somebody coming in and we're doing a drumming intervention and it's this frantic, very fast drumming, and by the end of the session, it's a very regulated rhythmic beat, I can see there's been a reduction in physical tension through the use of the tempo, through the speed, through observing the body language. Um, therapy is not a quick fix. It is about committing the time, following through the treatment process, using the strategies. Not dissimilar to driving a car. You're never going to learn how to drive a car if you don't do it every single day. And it's the same with therapy. So with mental health, if somebody needs some tools to help manage their anxiety or their guilt or their fear or whatever it is they're hanging on to, the consistency is using the techniques as the person suggests. So, that's another thing to take in mind. Often when people say to me, I've had all those different forms of therapy, nothing has worked, I often ask, how consistent were you in actually doing what was expected?
Mhm.
And that is part of that relationship. And I find with music, often with music, we love using music, and it's such a natural thing that we can use in so many ways. Also part of the work that I do, my humanistic approach, is giving you tools that you can take away and incorporate, whether it's, having a playlist to help you de-stress while you're driving, having a playlist to help you sleep, Maybe it is getting a small selection of instruments that you will play every day to engage in. Maybe it's you figuring out a song and going through a process of songwriting over 10 weeks where, as we sort of deal with whatever it is you need to work on, we do it through that process. But music therapy, it's tangible, it's something you can take away. And also, in some ways, it's fleeting because when we have a session, unless I record what you do, that moment that we've shared, once that moment is done, once that session is done, that moment moves on.
Hmm.
So there is a sort of transient aspect to music, which is, again, it changes the whole time.
Okay, before we shift gears to your military experience, was there anything else, kind of music therapy related that you wanted to bring up?
No, I think that was pretty much it.
I want to talk about your kind of military experience prior to entering music therapy. I guess mental health concerns are very prevalent in the armed forces and in first responders and people in that kind of a profession. From your experience, why do you think that is?
I can obviously only speak about my own experience,
Yeah.
having my sort of own lived experience having been through this. I think part of it is it's the expectations of the job, whether you're a soldier or a policeman or woman or a first responder or a nurse, a doctor, with these sort of very highly stressful jobs where you are dealing with a lot of adrenaline and a lot of pressure. I think there is a certain aspect of how your mental health will be affected. Going into the job, you know that there are going to be certain things you'll be expected to do, possibly see, and how you deal with those things. Any amount of training is useful, but also who you are as a person will sort of be the cause and effect. Like how you are as a person and how you deal with stuff will be how you're going to react, in the moment or as those things unfold. For me, the big one is pressure. There's a lot of mental pressure, physical pressure, emotional pressure put on you within certain jobs. And part of that is when you're dealing with those situations, you can't necessarily at that moment feel an emotion or get, deal with that thing in that moment. So, you've seen a traumatic event. There's the visual aspect of what has happened, there's the emotional aspect of what has happened, and now you carry that away from you. You can't, while you're dealing with this traumatic event, just burst into tears. Like that is, you are trained not to do that. But when you leave, what happens then? Do you just leave and you don't deal with it, and then it just keeps on building and building and building until it gets to a point where maybe you, I don't know, develop some bad habits and you're self-medicating through alcohol, like not a great coping mechanism. Or perhaps part of your training is you don't deal with it, but then maybe you need some peer support and you just go talk to a peer who's like, actually, maybe you need some professional help. And I think what's also really important is within these roles is knowing there's a time where you need peer support, but your peer, for most part, may not be a qualified mental health professional. And then you need to actually also know, where can I go to find the actual professional help too. And I think, again, within these roles as well, is part of it is perception. People have a perception of what a first responder does, what someone in the police does, what a soldier does. And that is a lot to also bear on your own shoulders. It was also interesting when people refer to me in the military, they refer to me as Fleur, a soldier, not different to being Fleur a therapist. But, Soldier Fleur was a very different person because I had to be a certain way and behave a certain way, and the expectation of what they expected to be in the military, I had to do that. And that can just wear you down. And I think for many of us who've been in the military or are in a first responder job, it's, I like using this analogy of you're like a sculpture. And all the little things that happen to you in your career or in your job or the things that you see and do, as they affect you, they start chipping away at you. So, you're the sculpture, you're finished, you're done with your military training, you go out, and then the expectations of the job come in, and as you deal with stuff, it's like they chip away, they chip away, they chip away, they chip away, until one day there's just this little piece of, I don't know, concrete or whatever it is or sculpture was made from. And that's you. But I think also how you fix these little chips and these little things and these little cracks that appear, that is like the mental health. How do you fix these little cracks? Do you seek professional help? Does your organization have a wellness or a mental health committee? Do you have insurance and you can access the sort of mental health supports through that? Um, so it's coping mechanisms, it's resiliency, and how do you not only as a person help yourself with those things, but also depending on where you work, whether it's the military, whether it's the police, whether it's a hospital, like what supports do they also have in place to make sure that you can stay sort of mentally, physically, and emotionally fit.
You talked about kind of the public perception of people in that field. Are there any kind of stigmas or incorrect perceptions that the general public kind of associates with the military or the armed forces that are not true or that bother you more than others?
You know, one thing that I always find interesting is, as a woman having served in the military, is the perception of how women are treated in the military.
Yeah.
I think many people think there's a us and them. So, there's like the way women do stuff and the way men do things. And I say to people that actually it's my family. They're my brothers and sisters. We are all in it together. And, in my experience of when I was in the military, it didn't make a difference that I was white, woman, South African, immigrant to the UK. None of those things made a difference. I was a soldier. And, if I had someone next to me who was a guy from a different country, different spirituality or whatever, that didn't make a difference to me because we were all in this together. So there's actually a great sense of cohesiveness. And in my experience, like a family being in the military. And I think often people think, because you're a woman, you're treated differently in the military, or because you're white, you're treated differently, or whatever. In my experience, that wasn't like that. I think something else as well is this experience that when you are, I guess, a soldier or in the police or a first responder, that you're not approachable. Like people think because you're a soldier that I cannot talk to you because maybe you think you're better than me or I'm scared to talk to you, whatever. And that's not true. Like when people spoke to me about what I did in the military, I welcomed it. I think there's another stigma, a stigma around mental health where people think it's like you don't feel things and you're taught not to feel with things, and I think there's a time and a place to feel. Sometimes you have to do your job, you cannot feel, you need to be the mechanical, the rational, but then actually, you know what, you can go away and spend time and work through those emotions and feel what you need to feel, and it's important. Because if you don't, and you repress all that stuff, it's going to cause more issues down the line. I think as well, maybe there's some stigma, again, stigma around mental health. I don't want to talk about it because it's a sign of weakness. And to that, I actually say no. My experience is a sign of strength. It takes strength to be in a certain job. It took a lot of strength for me to decide I'm going to be a soldier and go out to Afghanistan and be in a war. And, when things weren't great, to be able to say, actually, I need help with something. Or, you're my friend, you're my colleague, you're my family. You need help with something. Like, what can we do? And I think that's just a stigma around mental health, full stop. I think we think that people, when they have a mental health diagnosis, that diagnosis defines them. So just like the term soldier defined me, it was only one part of who I was. When somebody has a mental health diagnosis, for example, someone's bipolar, that's only one piece of who that person is. It doesn't define them. It doesn't only make them that diagnosis or, you know. And I think another thing as well is we do think it's weak for people to say, actually, I think I'm dealing with something. Maybe I have depression. Like maybe I need to go find some help. Maybe I need to take some time off to find some help. And in our society, I think we often think it's weak to say that we need to deal with stuff.
Yep.
But as Simone Biles even recently showed us with the Olympics, it takes strength to say, I need a time out to recover, to do what I need to do, to get myself mentally back to where I need to be able to carry on. And as you take a sick day to deal with the flu or whatever, maybe sometimes you need a mental health day to just help you get back on track.
Oh, I completely agree with that. I think companies should have mental health days as well as sick days.
Me too.
Yeah.
It's like a personal day, and sometimes you just need a personal day to work through whatever it is you're working through.
Mm-hmm.
And I think as well, people need to be a lot more transparent in saying, this is our mental health policy, this is our wellness policy.
Yeah.
It makes a difference also when you work for organizations who have policies where it's like, we're going to have a potluck and we're just all going to meet on Friday at lunchtime and get together and have a good laugh. I think in COVID, a lot of these things changed because we
Mm-hmm.
became so disconnected, we all had to isolate. But I think now, as we're sort of coming back to being in person again, being able to say, like, let's all go on a walk at lunchtime, a wellness walk. Maybe we need to have someone come in and do like an organizational music and mindfulness thing with us, like, to help us all just to reconnect as an organization, as a school, as a company, you know what I mean? And I think even just music, if you're in a meeting, why can't you start a meeting with a motivational song? Just things like that to help us sort of think more of a us or a we as opposed to a us and them. And most places, when I deal with organizations or companies or places in terms of wellness, I do ask, like, what is your mental health community like? Like, what supports are there for people? Are people aware of those supports? Sometimes people just aren't.
Mm-hmm.
It's like, if I have anxiety, what's EFAP? Who do I speak to? Like, and just knowing, making these things more visible as you make other things visible.
Yeah.
So
Yeah. Oh, I
yeah.
agree. Back to what you were saying before, I was going to ask you if your kind of experience in the military was different because you're a woman in what I assume is a male-dominated field. But I guess like you all dress the same. You all like you don't know anything about anyone else's past or history or what they have been through, and you're all in there for like one common goal. So that it kind of surprises me that you've experienced it in the same way that a man would. Um, but I love that.
How you mentioned, we sort of all look the same, we dress the same,
Yeah.
we all had to go through the same experience. Like when I was in basic training, we were all in the same thing together. It was all the same rules and regulations. And I think, again, when you're in a certain job, I think a lot of that just comes from assumption and perception.
Yeah.
So if you're not sure about something, feel free to ask. I think a lot of it also has to do with media portrayal. Um,
Yeah.
and again, my experiences are obviously just based on what I experienced. They might be different for somebody else. But I think if I think about, like, in the military, we're all in this together. We all have the same common goal that we're working towards. There's sort of neutrality. It's not like somebody meets me and says to me, so what's your mental health diagnosis? No one even knows whether I have that or not. And I sometimes wish, we could approach sort of mental health in terms of the way I went through my experience in the military, where when you go in, you're like a clean slate. No one really cares
Mhm.
about Fleur before she was in the military. And I wish, when somebody comes into a job or you meet someone in your life who perhaps has recently gotten a mental health diagnosis, as an example, like something like schizophrenia, um, you know, it should be like when someone says to you, I have schizophrenia, I'm just letting you know in case this ever comes up in the conversation. It should be like when Fleur went into the military. You shouldn't worry about all the other stuff that happened before that. It should be okay. And again, don't just judge that person based on their diagnosis. Like, if you'd known this person for a few years before they told you, or a few months, you've gotten to know this person, you like this person, you spend time with this person, you spend time with the person, the diagnosis isn't that person.
Mhm.
And just like in the military, um, being a soldier isn't the only thing that defines a person. So, I think, that's something I would like people out there to know, that we all have so many different facets and interests, and things, and I wish it was the same in how we see mental health.
Yeah.
If that makes sense.
Oh, absolutely. Yeah. Going back to what you said about the kind of the media perception or portrayal of the military. Oftentimes we hear about military personnel developing kind of mental health conditions like PTSD and things like that. Do you have any past trauma from being in the military that you hold on to?
I, I don't think so. I've explored this quite a lot. I wouldn't say trauma.
Mm-hmm.
I wouldn't say trauma. But one of the things that I noticed when I came back from my R&R after my tour, for instance, you're out in Afghanistan for 3 months. You then have like 2 weeks off before you go back to do your next 3 months. So our tours was like 6 months long. But what I find hard is you're in like a state of disconnection because you're away from your family for 3 months and then you have to come back to be with your family for about 2 weeks to then leave again. So it was interesting how I think for many people in those 2 weeks when they go back for their R&R or for however long it is, you're in this point of disconnection because you can't really reconnect with people, only to know that you're leaving again. I think another thing as well is a constant state, and often this is one of the main things with PTSD, but people go through this period of hypervigilance that just never seems to end. Um, and a big part of that is something I noticed actually when I left the army was the transition from being in the military. And I only served 5 years, so my experience wasn't even that long. But transitioning out of the military back into civilian life. And I think for a lot of people when they leave the military or the police again or any sort of first responder job, is it's the first 1 to 3 years which are the hardest because depending how long you've been in these organizations, you are trained a certain way. You become used to the processes, the rules, and things, and it's very hard to just let those things go when you transition back into civilian life. And so for me, the first year, it was hard just getting back into the sort of the flow of things. Things weren't so rigid or regimental. Um, in a way, freeing up, like you sort of become quite A-type. No, not A-type, but like you want things done a certain way, so sort of freeing up and being okay if things aren't done a certain way. It's okay to be there at 9 instead of always being there at 10 to 9. Like freeing up and just letting go. And that is actually something where music therapy really helped me a lot. Like improvisation is this idea of just playing freely. Not saying I'm going to start the music this way and do it that way. So improvisation helped me to free up in my life. Another thing as well is for people who feel this feeling of hypervigilance, like you're always on edge, like you're always waiting for something to happen. Again, the physical aspect of playing an instrument allowed me, like playing guitar, playing piano, playing flute, even singing, just allowed me to focus my time and attention on something else instead of this like feeling of uneasiness.
Mm-hmm.
Anxiety, I think, anxiety as well. Again, not something I had a formal diagnosis for, but I think being aware that it's a bit of a spectrum too. You have some days where if you're not sleeping well, you're not going to feel great. And you're going to notice some of that physical tension, that brain fog, that fear of what's happening next. And songwriting, something that helped me with that. By being able to just put down in my journal, and journaling is something I've done my whole life, and putting down in my journal how I was feeling, and then adding the piano into that and making the song. But I think it's I've always been a very self-aware person, so I was aware of when I wasn't sort of feeling myself, and I was able to work through that. And perhaps if somebody isn't very self-aware, but you have people around you telling you, I'm worried about you, you seem different, you're not quite the same, then maybe that is a point that you need to go and find some professional help. And again, don't be scared to seek that help because you're not scared to join the army or join the police or do the amazing thing you do as a first responder. Again, don't feel scared. If you can step up to do those things, you can step up to go to war. You can step up to go and find mental health support.
Yeah. Oh, I love that. I do have a couple questions for you that I like to ask a lot of my guests. The first one, we often forget that therapists and first responders, and in your case, like military personnel, are also just normal people that require like self-care and all of that kind of thing. So I'm curious for you, what do you do for self-care that is not music related?
Most definitely, the time I spend with my horse is self-care time for me. I I purchased a horse a year ago, so I go out to the ranch and spend time with her. And when I'm there, there's no music except for her melodious neighing and nickering. But I'm a pretty high. Well, I'll say hyper, but my energy is pretty high, and when I'm with her, I have to ground myself. Otherwise, she feeds off my energy and gets hyper too. So I love any time spent with animals. I do journal for my self care. I'm like, if I need to get something out of paper, I like doing that. So journaling has been something I've continued with in my life. I have my little hobbies that I enjoy doing. I've sort of, for the last sort of 2 years, started doing embroidery. Because again, when you're working with a needle and thread, you have to pay attention to pulling it through the hoop and be very mindful that you can prick your finger if you don't. And I think sometimes as well, it's just I like watching a lot of like old Western movies and military movies, but I find sometimes watching movies is also just for me a helpful way to just process and relate to. Oh, somebody else is doing that in the movie. Okay, I've been through that experience. I can relate to that. I can process it through that, and it just sort of takes my mind off things. But yeah, and just physical stuff. I'm quite a girly girl too now. It's funny. Even though I was in the military, I love having a nice long bath with aromatherapy. The more aromatherapy in there, the better. And just being out in nature while we can. Because in Canada we have very short summers.
Yeah.
So in summer I want to be, and now with COVID I don't want to be online. I want to be outside doing stuff.
Oh yeah, I agree 100%. Okay, my last question for you. Is there a stigma or a misconception surrounding mental health that bothers you the most, or that you hear most often but isn't true?
I think for me, it's just around the use of language.
Yeah.
Mental health language. It frustrates me when somebody just says, like, that's nuts, or I'm crazy, or you're making me crazy. I think we need to be more aware of how we are intentionally using language. So instead of something, saying, that's nuts, we could say, that's uncertain, or that's frustrating, or that's confusing. So I think, just the use of language is very important with how we address mental health things. I think, again, it's the idea that whenever we think about mental health, we also have this image of somebody who's a violent person. And again, in my experience, that is not true. Yes, there can be challenging behaviors, again, which if somebody is not safe for themselves or to others, often people then will be in, psych wards where that will be managed and dealt with there. But I think often, there's this idea that if somebody has a diagnosis, they must be violent. Or another thing which I think is farther from the truth is that if somebody has a mental health diagnosis, they can't keep down a job. And again, I think if somebody can't keep down a job, it isn't necessarily just because they perhaps have a mental health diagnosis. It could be so many other reasons as well. Maybe it isn't the right job for them. Maybe they don't have the right supports. Maybe they, just like for me, teaching wasn't the right job for me. I had to go through that period to understand it.
Yeah.
Same thing. If I was diagnosed with depression, if I left my job as a teacher because I was diagnosed with depression, all somebody would have seen was depression.
Yeah.
I didn't have a mental health diagnosis when I chose to leave my job. So I think as well, just again, some of these perceptions we have. Someone with mental health must be lazy. Someone with mental health, a mental health diagnosis isn't reliable, isn't trustworthy.
Yeah.
Again, those are only perceptions we have that have been perpetuated in some way, whether it's through popular culture, the media, or whatever. But in my experience, actually, are farther from the truth.
Yeah.
So, be informed, go to reputable websites, listen to podcasts like this, speak to professionals, and speak to people who've been through that experience, who have the lived experience, instead of just assuming that because, the fake news says this or that it's right.
Yeah. I love both of those. Those are huge. The language one is a big one for me too.
And I think my last thing that I would also say is just how we speak I sometimes feel it's like we always speak to someone. Um, but often when clients come to me, we talk about mental health. Don't speak to someone, speak with someone. There's a difference with
Yeah.
that too. So open. If you are the person asking the questions who isn't sure, be open to that experience and truly listen. Don't just hear, but listen to what someone's telling.
Okay. If people have more questions for you or want to reach out, what is the best way for them to contact you?
They can definitely email me. So my email is fleur@supportingwellness.com. And if people want to find out a bit more about music therapy or any of the other mental health supports that they offer, they can go to www.supportingwellness.com. They're on Instagram, they're on Facebook, they're on email. So feel free, reach out there, and my contact details are on there as well.
Perfect. Okay. Well, thank you for joining me one more time. I think this conversation was amazing as well. So I'm super excited for this episode. Thank you so much for tuning in today. Feel free to reach out at any time. You can contact me on Instagram and Facebook at Stomp the Stigma YYC, and you can email me at stompthestigmayyc@gmail.com. If you like the podcast, please like and subscribe on YouTube, Spotify, Google Podcasts, or Apple Podcasts. And if you or someone you know would like to come on, I would love to have you. Share your story, speak your truth, and together we can stomp the stigma.